for those of you who don't know, the UEC, or the Urban Ecology Collaborative, is a group of urban greeners of all kinds. We started with mainly urban forestry and have since expanded to other kinds of urban greening. And we span the Northeast and into the Mid-Atlantic. And we're just a network of people who want to talk about urban ecology, learn best practices, and also hear from each other's mistakes and failures so that we can all grow together and be better. So I am one of the co-chairs. My name is Kinsey Miller. I am an arborist for Northwood Tree Care in Pittsburgh. And David.
Hi, David Meshrulam. I am executive director of a urban and community forestry nonprofit in Boston called Speak for the Trees.
And today we have Katie Lautar from Baltimore Green Space presenting. I don't have the bio pulled up, so definitely, David, if you could.
It's on to me. Yeah, well, thank you. Before I introduce Katie, I just wanted to note that we will be meeting again next month. And right now on the schedule, we have Mike Alonso, Assistant Professor of Environmental Science at American University, who will be joining us. Don't believe we have a title yet for the talk, but Mike and I had a nice chat the other week, and he's excited to present his work. And then in October, we have not fully confirmed, but we're hoping to have Diana Moran from the Conservation Law Foundation here in Boston join us to talk about ordinances for private and public trees. And I know she's done some work in that field, specifically for Cambridge, right across the river in Boston. So it's my distinct pleasure today to welcome Katie. Katie's talk is entitled Baltimore's Green Spaces, Communities, Mythologies, Equity, and Advocacy. What a wonderful and interesting title, and I'm sure her talk will hit on a lot of the things we share here at UEC. Katie will talk about Baltimore's Green Spaces work protecting green spaces and promoting forest patch care, and where this work intersects with confronting ecological urban legends, highlighting equity issues and other advocacy adventures. The talk will touch on equity issues that produce the community managed green spaces in Baltimore, common misconceptions about urban wild, and showcase past and current advocacy campaigns. Katie has a rich bio, and I'll just read what she shared with us. She took helm of the organization after 7 years working as program director. Born and raised in Baltimore, she came to this work through her love of Baltimore, nature, and communities. Katie has more than 16 years experience in community organizing, designing nonprofit programs, and creating educational programs. She earned a master's degree in environmental education from Lesley University, right here in Boston, while living outdoors in different bioregions. She earned her bachelor's degree at Goucher College, and Katie, I have a story to share to you about Goucher, in elementary education with a minor in peace studies. She directed youth development and education programs at Strong City, Baltimore, and is a founder of the 2640 Cooperative. She also has considerable experience in consensus building models and collaborative program development. So Katie, before you begin, Goucher College, my wife's grandmother went there, I guess in the 1920s or 30s, born and raised in St. Louis. And she was called back to St. Louis because she was having, quote, too much fun as a young girl in Baltimore.
That sounds possible in that time period, especially. Goucher was the finishing school for Hopkins' wives at that time. So.
Well, they told her to come back to St. Louis and finish properly there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, so I guess we're ready to share screen, and can you all see my screen?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for coming. As some of you I know very well, and some of you are new to me, and I look forward to hopefully getting to know you and your focus areas and kind of the advocacy that you're doing and the environmental passion work you're doing where you are. for those of you who have seen presentations by me before, some of this will not be new for you, but hopefully it'll be entertaining enough that you'll still have a good time. I'm going to talk about, as they mentioned, I'm the executive director of Baltimore Green Space. I am in my 9th year with the organization. So if you have questions about any of this work, it's likely that I actually can give you more detailed answers if that's needed, as we go through this, if later you want some kind of nuance. But I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of our work. So these are 2 young women who are watering the garden at Brentwood Commons. And they are the representatives, the charismatic representatives of their neighborhood. They care for this space. They dance at this space. They play at this space. And so I wanted to start off with them. They're why we do the work. They do the work themselves as well. And I'm going to keep it moving. So let's see. I can't go next slide. There we go. All right, so I always like to start our talks about the green spaces in Baltimore as much as possible with a legacy of redlining. This is a redlining map of Baltimore City. And one of the things that we feel like it's important to do is to lift up this legacy as part of the narrative of the green space work here. So as you can see, the red area is the areas that were disinvested in. And this is like an invisible thing that is still very visible on the landscape. So as you might notice, these are the vacant lot map, completely, almost directly correlates with the redlining map of the past. So this history is still present in a very visible way today. And what is also true is that the green spaces in Baltimore City actually that are cared for by community leaders, overlays with that map as well. So there are over 300 green spaces in Baltimore on land that can be bought and sold. Baltimore Green Space maps those spaces. There are even more spaces that are on school land or protected on nonprofit land. We map what is on land that could be bought and sold and what is not yet protected. We also don't put anything in our database unless we know a community connection in that space. So, if you know of a green space you want to check out is still on our map, let us know. But part of our responsibility is to tell this story, that Baltimore has a lot of stories moving. One is of redlining and one is of the community power that is combating that disinvestment. And for every green space here, there are, anywhere from 10 to 100 people taking care of those spaces. And so the other thing we want to point out for you is that one of the roles that we like to play is doing this work so that we can map it and illustrate, again, that the majority of the green spaces in Baltimore are in majority African-American neighborhoods. So what you're looking at is the percent of African-American community folks in the neighborhood regions here. And so what you see is that all of these green spaces here are in African-American neighborhoods from 60 to 97%. And we see it as part of our role to, whenever possible, ask why aren't these spaces being invested in? And ask where the funding is and where it isn't. And this becomes even more pronounced now that we're working on Project Vital with the Bloomberg School of Public Health and a bunch of partners to map more of the green spaces, and it has a lot more of the partners. And if you're from Baltimore, what you hear a lot of talk about is the black butterfly, that the black neighborhoods are in a butterfly around what's called the white L. And you can very clearly, these are green space, more of the green spaces. So some of this is also stormwater infrastructure. This has been mapped by BINIA and Project Vital. And you can very clearly see the butterfly even more pronounced in the green spaces that people have created, so, or care for. So right now in our database, we have 287 community green spaces. 163 of those are growing food and flowers, 41 are pocket parks, 57 are clean and greens, and 26 are forests. But there are way more forests, but we will talk about that later. So all of this, knowing all of this, our founder worked with Baltimore City to develop the process for transferring land to quality, transferring Baltimore City land to qualified land trusts. And so this is the city's policy for transferring land, which allows land that a city owned to be transferred to a qualified land trust for $1 per lot. Baltimore Green Space helped to create this policy, but this policy is available to any land trust that wants to follow the process. And as we already noted, there are more than enough things to preserve. So, and there are other land trusts in Baltimore. We are just the one that has preserved the most green spaces so far. So what does Baltimore Green Space do? So this is, these are neighbors taking a green space. This is Brentwood Commons, which you saw earlier where the girls were. This is the beginning of that project where it was, actually there was a house that was demoed here first. The neighbors had to fight to get the house demoed because it was dangerous. And they worked really hard to do that. And then after they worked really hard to do that, they worked really hard to make it a park. And this is an earlier picture of it, but now it has even, as you can see, the neighbors enjoying the park. It now has even more flowers, as you saw with the girls watering earlier. But part of our work is to teach people the different levels of land security in Baltimore City. So while we do preserve land and we do forest advocacy, we also tell people the different processes they could use to protect community green spaces. Because in Baltimore, there's a spectrum of green spaces. There are privately owned green spaces, there are publicly owned green spaces. And when I say publicly owned, they're owned by the city, and each has its different realm of permission that's required. And so if you're on privately held land, you want to go through what's called the self-help nuisance abatement process. And we walk people through what that means and how to do that. If you're on city-owned land, there's the adopt a lot process, and we're happy to walk people through that. And then as a piece of that, we work with Baltimore City to identify the green spaces in Baltimore as quality community managed open spaces. So a space can be identified as quality community managed open space once it is 3 years old, it actually looks like a place, and it has neighborhood investment. And that takes it off Baltimore City's active for sale lists once we provide that list. And so actually that's what I just went through this part. So if you want to look at that, that's how you become a qualified community managed open space. And so this is the map again. And so we map all of those spaces, and then we provide a list of the spaces to Baltimore City and identifying them as to whether or not they're QCMAS. So that's one piece of the work. So currently, Baltimore Green Space protects 16 spaces, over 7 acres of land, 8 food gardens, 5 pocket parks, 2 forests, 1 horseshoe pit, and a partridge in a pear tree. So hopefully we'll be protecting 3 more spaces this year, but here are some of them. Duncan Street Miracle Garden was preserved in 2010. It was the third space we preserved. This is 500 North Duncan Street. This is Mount Clair Community Garden, Upper Fells Point Community Garden, Victorine Q. Adams, Ash Street Community Garden. Here are pocket parks. This was our first swing set. So, and now forest patches. That's Fairwood Forest. This is Springfield Woods. So what do we look for when we're protecting a site? The site has to be at least 5 years old. The request has to come from the community. which means that somebody who lives in the county can't say like, I want to adopt a lot and I've been taking care of this in the city and we want you to protect it. There has to be a site leader, an assistant site leader, a community partner, and a core group of volunteers. All of that is about sustainability of the site. The site has to benefit the neighborhood, and there must be a match between the soil and the site's use. So why does the site have to be 5 years old or more? Because it takes a while for a site to go from a project to a place. This is the harvest. It is the garden of the founder of our organization, Miriam Avens, and it is part of what inspired our whole organization to exist. And we have learned over time that everybody's excited about keeping their community garden going in years 1, 2, and 3, but 4 is the hump year where everyone's like, whoa, like land is forever. We don't know if we can do this. So that is why it's 5 years. So it has to have a site manager and an assistant site manager. This is mainly so that we know what point people to contact, or to, who's going to be our main point of contact. Some of our green spaces are really run collectively and there's no main leader. And then others have a charismatic leader that is like the key person that tells everybody what to do. It has to have a community partner. This is so for 2 reasons. One, so that we know that the community is actually invested in this group of people preserving the space long term. But it's also so if for some reason something goes wrong or both site leaders move away, we have an on the ground partner who can help us figure out how to troubleshoot issues with the site, and in the event that like getting a new site manager wasn't provided by the people leaving, then we would work with a community partner to help us do that. It has to be in true community use. That means it can't just be you taking care of it for your dog and not letting anybody else have the vegetables or come on your park. It has to really be used by the community. That can look like a lot of things. That can look like you providing vegetables. That can look like kids playing there. That can look like people actively gardening. It's not just one thing. It all kind of depends on the site itself. This is a stage that was created by the 6th Branch community and Meraki Uplift over in the Oliver community. The kids wanted a tree house, but the legality of a tree house was a little bit hard. So this was their compromise. It has to have a sustainable amount of volunteers to keep it going into the future. We now have 4 staff, but we used to just have 2. And our favorite phrase to say was, there are only 2 of us and we don't own a weed whacker and we don't ever want to have to. So you all will continue to care for the space. It's still true. The point is that the community gets to continue to maintain it as they have. And one of the things we look for is to make sure that that's a sustainable core. In reference to the soil, these are actually from forest soils, but it's a good illustration. We always do soil testing as part of the process to make sure that there's not lead in the soil where people are digging or eating food. It's out of 16 cases, out of 16 sites, 3 have only shown up with lead soil, and all of those could be remediated before they were brought into the trust. So the key benefits of preservation are that those sites get to retain their green spaces for community use. And so this is really important when you have communities that have invested all this time and energy. This is one of the most important things, is that this property will never be taken away from the community as long as it's in the trust. It'll never have a building on it. We provide basic liability insurance and technical assistance for issues that arise that leaders need help with. So I'm trying to think what else to say about that. I guess the one thing to point out about no more worries about redevelopment, we have seen at some points where just having a garden on a space actually makes a developer want to buy that space. It's kind of odd, but we have seen that happen, especially with a few of our community farms. And so why is ownership important? Ownership is important because of what I mentioned about development pressure. and the neighborhoods retaining their investment themselves, their investment of love. But it's also important because if they want to change anything, so if you look at this picture, you'll see that there's a mosaic on the sidewalk. The tree pits have been enlarged. This is actually pervious paver material here. This garden was able to do this because we're able to pull permits for them. They were able to change their vision of how the front walk looked. They couldn't do any of that without owning the property. The other reason ownership is important of these green spaces is that usually it results in increased investment around the spaces. So this is actually when Brentwood Commons, which we started the show with, started. Only one of these houses was not boarded up, and every other one was boarded up. In this image, only one is boarded up. And now they've all been purchased and people are living in them. So this garden went from being surrounded by boarded up properties to being surrounded by homeowners caring for and renters living in these spaces. So how long does the process take? It takes 6 months to 3 years because of various steps of the process. The shortest amount of time it has ever taken is 6 months. The longest amount of time it took was 3 years because there was a foreclosure process that had to be gone through. That really is the most lengthy process. And there are a lot of different steps to the preservation process that involve us doing environmental research and historical research as well. I'm just kind of giving you the basics really here. But why did we get involved with forests? So through our work with neighbors, we had neighbors reach out to us and say, hey, we've got a forest. There were 4 different neighborhood leaders at one time in 2012 that all came to us around the same time. And they said, hey, we've got a forest. Can you protect it? Or do you know anything about how to care for forests? Is this a trash forest? That's a question we really got, a trash forest. I really want you to strike this idea that there's a trash forest from your head if it exists in yours. It takes people some time to do so, but that got us working with neighbors. We started working with neighbors and forest patches because of neighborhood requests. But when we do our work, we always try to combine our work with analysis and advocacy. So when we learned about all these forest patches in Baltimore, that got us asking, well, how many of them are there really? And we learned that there are more than 1,000 forest patches of 10,000 square feet or more in Baltimore, and it actually makes up more than 20% of Baltimore's tree canopy. Actually, more than 20% of Baltimore's tree canopy is on forest patches that can be bought and sold. So in the spectrum of environmental health and increasing the tree canopy, without protecting forests from development, we're not going to increase our tree canopy at the rapid rate that we'd like to. Our Tree Baltimore and their partners have made a lot of gains there, but they've also would have had higher gains without development if there was protection. So we did 100 on the ground surveys. And this is just another map of the same thing, but just more detailed. This map zooms into the numbers of the patches. And part of the reason that even motivated us further in this work is that this is a forest, this is 2 lots of a forest patch. This used to be completely forested, and it was sold in the side lot program. And that got us looking at the forest patch at the regulations protecting forests. We wanted to know how many forests were vulnerable, what were the regulations that made them vulnerable, and what we learned is that the forest conservation triggers wouldn't protect smaller patches, and that smaller patches are actually really crucial to neighborhood cooling benefits and neighborhood health, especially when you have so few forests. I mean, in cities, forests are kind of like endangered species and should be thought of that way, in my opinion, as an environmental leader. And in the spectrum of climate change, I really think that's how everyone should be thinking of them. And so that made us write this white paper highlighting all of the holes in regulations and making recommendations about how those regulations should be changed, including suggesting that the forest conservation trigger be moved down to a minimum of 10,000 square feet. And we've since made a lot of progress on that, but I'll tell you more about that later. When we started working with forests, we had a lot of like questions and misconceptions and like mythologies about what an urban forest would be. And so that's why I have this like scary picture, the forest. This is what the forest like sounded like in urban areas. This idea of a trash forest. This idea that Maryland, the invasive trees were going to be dominating all of our forests, and that the soils were going to be damaged and like just, but we were like visiting forests and we were like, what? That's not what we see. Like, we know that's not what we see. And at the time, we hadn't done enough analysis to be able to speak clearly about that. But in our partnerships, oh wait, the other thing people think they're going to find is these kind of needles, not pine needles. And so what we started doing is documenting with our friends at UMBC and the US Forest Service and the Office of Sustainability what we were really seeing, and quantifying it. And we designed a forest health protocol that actually is fully designed now. I should have put a picture up, but I didn't. But anyway, one of the things we discovered is that our canopy is more than 80% native trees in almost every single forest we have been in, with the exception of one that had like a, power line that destroyed some of its forests. So when you have this idea that, oh, it's going to be Ailanthus, no, we have a native canopy to protect, and it's our responsibility to protect it. Soils, we were told we would only find an A layer. We'd be lucky if we found an A layer, which is like the second healthiest layer of soil. O is the healthiest, A is the second. We'd be lucky if we found that. All of them had an A, some of them had an O. And so, our forest soils are healthy. 32% of the 88 patches had a water feature, right? Like if you think of like Baltimore's forests, you think of spring-fed streams. No, you don't. But we have them. And we also have forest interior dwellers. So one of the things we do is we combine the science with experiences with neighborhood leaders so they can get up close and personal with the nature. This is a bird banding exercise where everybody came out to like look at the birds. And we're also doing some research with partners on how forest patches impact heat. And we're learning that forest patches are, as you would expect, the best at cooling neighborhoods of any other tree type, whether it be street trees or trees above grass, right? Like forests are still better for cooling. And so back to doing all of this work, it was kind of important for us to do this work in tandem, where we work with neighbors to educate and we work with policy leaders to educate them. Then we eventually had enough of a core group to start working on the tree ordinance and change the forest conservation triggers. So we worked for several years with partners at the Office of Sustainability, Blue Water Baltimore, actually DPW, Tree Baltimore, and the Baltimore Forestry Board, to create an ordinance that would move the forest conservation triggers down to 5,000 square feet. So now, and also change some things about how much it cost, like what are the mitigation fees? We changed the mitigation fees. So we were successful last year. We are also going to be working on some other ordinances, but I want to go back to, so there it is. That's what it looks like, the signed version. So this is Fairwood Forest. This is the first forest we protected, and this is part of the community that spends time there. And I want to go back to some of the equity conversation from the beginning. So where equity falls into our work Well, actually, equity should always be infused into every part of this work in a diverse city like Baltimore, and in a city that is majority African American. And so we try to really work, well, we make equity goals, and we're working on those. And so one of the things, the whole project in and of itself, preserving land, is meant to preserve land to retain it for the communities that care for them. And as you saw at the beginning of the slideshow, the majority of the communities caring for green spaces in Baltimore are majority Black communities. And so in this world of environmentalism, that at least in the circles of nonprofit world tends to be unusually white, we make it one of our goals to kind of start talking about that with our other white environmentalists, and talk about how do we shift this narrative. One, how do we make sure the narrative doesn't stand? There are this many environmentalists, African American environmentalists. We should be standing shoulder to shoulder at all times, right? Like in all spaces. And if we're not, there's something about what we are doing that we all need to work on together. And we need to try new things. And so we try new things. The results, this community engagement endeavor that is more representative of the community around it, resulted from door knocking, consistent several days of door knocking the neighborhood around to invite people and welcome them to come out. And so we try to ask ourselves, when we're doing our work, who is at the table, and is there a meaningful role for the community? We don't always do it perfect, and we keep trying when we don't. So when I say we don't always get it perfect, here's an example. This is a more recent event at Fairwood Forest. It was a successful event, and also you can see it has a very different demographic. And it's notable, right? And so we are asking ourselves, how do we make sure that, this happens more often than this, right? So progress and not perfection is what we're going for. And so another thing I love to bring up is we have to be graceful with rejection in this work. Once we decided that community door knocking was like really good and it worked with this community, and then we recommended it at another site, and our pastor at Still Meadow was like, they have been door knocking us to death over here. Please do not door knock our community, right? And so we had to be like, okay, we have to come up with another strategy, because we've gotten feedback from the leaders that we care about that what we want to do is not going to work. And so it's about relationship and honoring the relationships that we're in. And that's what we hope to carry forward in our work. So from that relationship, we build from combined strengths. When we're our best selves, we build from combined strengths, co-creating the work. So if you look at this flyer, our team didn't touch any piece of this flyer, because one of our leaders is a graphic designer. He's he makes cartoons, he writes screenplays, and he created this flyer for Springfield Woods. And so this is kind of like our ideal. All of our flyers that we put out are approved by the community before they go out. And it takes longer, but also it feels better. So as we go through with like solidifying our equity goals in the world, we are working on progress tracking, making sure there are budget allocations to this work, making sure they're present in policies and our hiring practice, and soliciting feedback and advocating with our peers. So wait, I wanted to tell you. Okay, so back to our advocacy work. So it all started with creating the process to preserve spaces so that now there is one and they can be protected. At one point, we worked on the irrigation fund to get water out to green spaces. That was under Miriam Avon's tenure. She did such amazing work founding this organization. Providing lists so that we can advocate that green spaces be taken off for sale lists. writing white papers to identify problem areas and suggest solutions. We also recommend that, whenever possible, combining data analysis with identifying problems, but also providing solutions. And working to create regulations that make all of this possible. Before we preserved forests, we actually also had to pass a bill to allow us to be tax exempt and allow land trusts to be tax exempt. So this is actually that bill. And this is the tree ordinance bill that we just passed. And right now we're working with our partners to work on tree ordinances, to work on a few more tree ordinances. One is going to protect trees like heritage trees so that healthy trees that are big just can't be chopped down without some mitigation fees or repercussions. And updating the forest conservation manual fully. We just did a small update with this bill, but the next bill will go through the entire what's it called? The entire manual. So that's my fly-by-night for you.
That is amazing, and so impressive on how you're pulling together so many threads across the city, from community to city management. So thank you for that. We have about 18 minutes left for questions. I'm just going to go through the list here and pick up on some of the questions and themes, and then people can raise their hands or just hop on and unmute themselves to ask questions. Let me just, everyone's talking about popsicles. Let me go to the right place here. So there's a question here about if you're able to share the new ordinance at all.
The new ordinance? Yeah. I can send out the link afterwards, but sure. Yeah. And I've done a lot of research on ordinances, and if you are working on an ordinance, I'm in a bunch of ordinance networks, so let me know.
So I, for one, would love to talk to you. There's a hearing next week in Boston about an ordinance.
Okay.
And we're looking at private and public.
Right. We're working on both too. So yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Let's see. There's a comment here how impressive it is that 80% are native. That is really impressive.
Well, it is impressive, but also I would really encourage you, if your city thinks, well, first, one of the things we also got was oh, we don't have forest patches in our city. And DC was one of the places that said this. And I was and out of curiosity, the scientists we work for mapped the forest patches of DC. And I was able to go back to them and say, actually, no, you do. We have a map of them and we can send it to you. So just because you don't see the forest patches in your city every day doesn't mean they're not there. And then as far as everybody, I don't want to say everybody, but the common mythology around Baltimore was that our tree canopy was invasive. And that's because nobody was going in and identifying trees and looking at them. And so, maybe you're speaking from a space of you have analyzed your own forests in your neighborhoods. I know what company I'm in right now here, but if you're not, I would say get your scientist friends to go out with you and look at stuff. Because it's, yeah.
And how do you find funding for something like that? I mean, you've sort of, all my neurons are firing now. How can we start analyzing that data here in Boston? What resources do you pull in?
What you do is you partner with a science school. We're partnered with UMBC and the U.S. Forest Service, and they want projects to right. have their field researchers in. What you have to find is well, actually, we're really lucky to work with Dr. Matt Baker, who is a forest enthusiast and just environmental advocate all around. And so what you have to do is you have to find your professors. You have to find your professors because they have access to, have projects that they want to explore in forests. Yeah, that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, well, we have a few universities here in Boston, so.
Yeah, you have quite a few.
All right, other questions here for Katie? Usually not such a shy crowd.
Hi there, I'm Marcus Ferreira from PHS Tree Tenders Steering Committee volunteer in Philadelphia. And so the comment on the 80% composition being impressive, there's also a question tied to that, which is, had there been a ban on highly invasive species in a long-standing manner? Because it's amazing that you don't have Norway maples and calorie pears coming in and crowding things out.
No, there hasn't been a ban on invasives. I think the ban that everyone is really interested in Baltimore is the English ivy ban, because we know it's the biggest invader in forests, and now we can actually say that because we have a ground layer data set to say, like, it of all the forests, it's the biggest invader, and I think porcelainberry is next. But no, we don't. And it's funny because even some of the trees that everyone loves to talk about as invasives, I would say the invasive tree I've seen the most in Baltimore's forest patches is the Norway maple. But you know, people love to holler about Paulownia. I mean, if I see it in a forest, it's just in one place. It's not like, it doesn't seem aggressive the way that invaders are described as being. So it's been interesting because it's like, I get to be like, well, I have been in enough. That's the fun thing about doing long-term work, is at some point you are able to think to the number of forests you've been in and think, oh, is that true? I don't know. I don't think so, you know?
So I've got a question. What do the layers look like in the forests? I mean, in a lot of areas, our concern is that we don't, either because of ground level invasives and the shrub and herbaceous, or just because of impacts of foot traffic and whatnot, the concern is the ability for the forest to continue to regenerate. How are they looking there? Is that something that they need a lot of help with, or does that look pretty good?
It's interesting. It varies from forest to forest. We do have forests that have deer pressure and the layers aren't good, but that was one of the things that got another advocacy point, was the expectation was going to be, was always, when you talk about urban versus rural, there's this weird thing that's like, it's urban versus rural, like they're like in some kind of fighting match. But we would hear a lot that you wouldn't have seedlings present because of deer pressure, but in our urban areas, we have a lot of seedlings present. And I think it is in some cases because of the roads surrounding the forest patches, they are actually like kind of almost have an island effect to them ecologically. And so, that is what kind of has us challenging different assumptions that are put out there. But I would say that there are some that are, that do have deer pressure, and in general, in the urban forest world, there's always a lot of talk about replanting trees, and not a lot of, when removal of invasives happens, the approach to replanting is solely tree focused. And philosophically, we differ in belief in our organization. We think there should be some understory planting as well. That is not just canopy focused. I don't know if that answers your question, but so I guess your question was, do they have problems with understory? Some of them do, but some of them, we have foresters walk into Hep Park and are like, oh my God, how did this get like this? This looks like an intact. They thought it was a remnant forest at first until when we looked at the historical data, and we know it's not, but it looks so healthy, like it could be.
That's awesome because just even going by parklands, that's what I see a lot of are the problems with the lower layers.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a values shift. I think that there's some weird focus. I don't know, weird is maybe the wrong word, on growing tree stock, and without this understanding that the understory community is part of the forest community, and it's part of what makes a forest whole and healthy.
So there's a question here from Zojen, who I think knows you with a big
Yeah.
smiley face, asking, can you talk in more detail about the cooling effects of forest patches for nearby communities? So many groups like Blue Water Baltimore are focused on planting new street trees, but patches are truly the lungs of our city. How does that relate to issues like public health? And I actually had a similar question when I was looking at your graph that you shared with the 4 different temperature gradients. It seemed like areas without trees were cooler than areas with street trees, but maybe I didn't understand the graph.
It's not like street trees aren't as effective as everyone thinks they are. There's actually a new paper out about that. Well, it's not exactly about that. It's kind of like, it's more complex than that. So we always want everything to be simple. So when I started asking my friends about the cooling effects of forests, like where's the study that just shows us what we all know, that forests are better at cooling than any other thing. And of course, nobody had looked at it because it was another one of these things where everybody just knows it's true, so we don't study it. But now in the era of climate change, where like all this money has been put into planting trees, which like I totally believe in, and our forests are so important and no one is treating them like they are. And so when we talk about this, so the new paper is showing, forests are better at cooling. So let's talk about what that means. So first of all, a lot of the temperature data is based on temperature gauges from cars driving around, right? And so there is a lot less data of like people going into the forest and taking a temperature reading and versus like driving past the forest. So, but even looking at that, and so now there are some folks working on studies where they actually like ride bikes through the forest and compare everything. And so what we know is that forests are better at cooling, and what that means, and also like, so they cool the surrounding neighborhood. And street trees don't do that as well until the street tree percentage gets to a certain level. That there are certain, I'll send you the link. There are certain times of day that street trees are more helpful, but at other times of day they don't carry the same heat benefits and cooling benefits and a forest just is, even in the wintertime, forests have cooling benefits. So, I mean, is that what you wanted to hear, Zoe?
Are you talking about Carly Zeider's work? Is that part of what you're referring to?
Yeah, this is Matt Baker's new paper. Yeah.
Oh, Matt. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Oh, and Mike is saying that he wrote that up with
I didn't
Matt.
know you're his partner in that team. So Mike, do you want to tell them more carefully because Mike knows how to say this and I'm just speaking generally.
Sure. I won't. Hi, everyone.
This is so important.
This is great because it's like a natural handoff till next month too.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks, Katie. I just texted Matt saying he's been referred to as a forest enthusiast and on the UEC call, which I liked. So yeah, I won't talk too much here because I will talk about this again next month in more detail. But we used some of the CAR data, which the The downside, as Katie said, is that you have to stay on roads, so the thermometer is always on roads. But the upside is that it's becoming pretty widespread across a number of cities now, including DC, Baltimore, Richmond, Boston, like lots of places now. So and the other thing is that it's available in the mid-afternoon, so kind of the heat of the day, roughly pre-dawn, so at the coolest part of the day, and then also in the late afternoon / early evening. And so I think the summary would be, as others have found previously, big forest patches as kind of places that have a core within a 15-meter buffer of an edge. Those are the places that really offer the sustained cooling benefit during the heat of the afternoon in a way that kind of more sporadic plantings, either over pavement or not over pavement, can't really do. And then where we were interested in something different was in the early evening. The distributed trees that were not part of these patches, we were a little bit, could do some cooling. And we didn't study the mechanisms, but it might be, one thing that has to contribute is that in the early evening, all these trees are shading at about 4 times the length of their height. So there's lots of shadowing in a way that is more useful for distributed trees around, kind of planted independently, than for a forest patch. And then perhaps transpiration picks back up because they're less these kind of trees that are more among impervious surface and less happily growing in a forest patch. They're able to open up their stomata again and get going. So that's kind of, for future work to figure that out. And then the other nice piece about distributed canopy is that it's easier to plant new versions of in a place like DC, which, as Katie said, does have forest patches, but it's hard to make new forest patches in a lot of places. So we did just start looking at the Baltimore data. We're not deep into that yet, but Matt was very interested because he's like, it is different. Baltimore is different in terms of its forest configuration than DC. So we're curious, in a place that is climatically very similar. The data was collected one day after the data was collected in DC for temperature. So there's a lot of sameness there, which is useful to see if the configuration of the city and the patches of forest are lead to anything different as far as the magnitude and spatial variability of cooling. So I'll stop there. That's the preview for a month from now. But thanks, Katie.
You're welcome, and thank you for your work. But this is part of the work, is like, we get to ask these fun questions, and we ask them to our friends like Dr. Matt Baker. I mean, all of his, he is like a real thought partner in the work. Like, kind of everything we do is in partnership with him and folks at the U.S. Forest Service, Nancy Santi, Ian Yasalonis, and Morgan Grove as well. And but what it is that you ask your friends these questions who like have more access to science and like the people who can help you think through these problems, and then you figure out, well what are the nuances of the questions together, and you get to like explore it, and then they invite their friends who are passionate to look at something similar. And but all of that leads to us having stronger advocacy. Like, our questions are led by, if I can just prove that forests are better at managing stormwater and better at cooling, then how can we get more dollars into protecting forests, into neighbors getting paid to care for forests, into creating a forest care workforce, and into ultimately protecting the like long-term environmental benefits to all of our communities. And it's like, I'm grateful for that this Trillion Trees bill is coming out, or it has come out and been funded. And also, like, we need the like no more forests can get cut bill. Like, climate change means no cutting forests, right? Like that is really how I feel. So
So I want to just acknowledge it's 11, and Katie might have to go. There's still a couple of questions here, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity. First of all, big thank you. Round of applause for Katie's amazing work and for teeing up Mike beautifully for next month. So glad, Mike, you could join us and answer that question and get everything ready. So we'll see you on September, help me out here, Kinsey. September what? 15th or 22nd? 15th, I think.
I'm not sure. Let me check.
I think it's the 15th. Same time, same place. Just
It is the 15th.
yeah.
Same time, same place.
And we'll be putting this recording out. Katie, I have so many questions for you. We're dealing with an ordinance here in the city. We're dealing with trying to preserve 14 acres of forest in an EJ community. So I'm gonna ping you separately. Do you have a minute to answer a question here?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I definitely have some time for more questions if people want to stay on and ask questions. Yep.
Thank you. So there's a question here from Marcus, and I had the same question actually that we're trying to explore. And I imagine your answer is going to be it's complicated, but how far does the cooling effect from urban forest patch extend outside of the patch? Just to the immediately surrounding adjacent roads, or is it multiple blocks?
It looks like Mike answered that question.
Oh, he did. Thank
Can
you.
extend to 500 to 1,000 meters, but it depends on wind.
Got it. Thank you, Mike. I would love to see that a notation for or a citation for that if you have it.
Yeah, there's a there's a number of different studies to look at the park cool island effect.
Yeah.
But it is, yeah, it's definitely highly variable, and it's a little bit hard to study at some level because you gotta, are you tracking the wind at that certain location? We only tracked the wind at kind of one at the Washington Post building, basically. So how much does that apply to other places? But I think that's the general idea is that, yeah, you have to live kind of near a patch to get the benefit of cooling from patches, but it still can extend a bit depending on the weather conditions.
And I imagine it also depends on the size and type of patch.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's another study somewhere that says that once a patch is at a certain size, it doesn't have added cooling benefits if it gets even bigger. Like, and I'd have to ask Morgan about that, but yeah. So it's not necessarily how you would think all the time, you know? So are there other questions?
Well, Katie's generously dropped her email in the chat window if you would like to reach out to her. Thank you so much. Such inspirational work and really a model for me, at least in the thinking where we're at. And I can only assume that other people found it equally inspiring. So thank you.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much for being here with me, everyone. See you later.
Bye.